Hello, my name is Wolfgang Alschner. I'm the Hyman Soloway Chair in Business and International Trade Law at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Today I want to briefly introduce my contribution to the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Judicial Behaviour on network analysis. In particular, I want to briefly explain why network analysis is useful and intuitive. Then I'll go into a very brief overview into network analysis itself, network analysis theory and measures. And then I'll briefly talk about network analysis of law, especially from a comparative perspective, looking at both social network analysis and document network analysis. And I'll explain why the distinction is important. Finally, I'll conclude with some challenges and a discussion on the research frontier. So why is network analysis useful and intuitive? Well, network analysis is a crude abstraction of reality. It's representing relationships as nodes that are connected by ties, abstracting all else what is going on. Now that is incredibly crude, but it is incredibly useful. It is incredibly useful in part because it is very intuitive. Look at this simple network graph that you see in front of you. You immediately have associations with respect to that network. You see node A that sits in the middle of these two network segments. That might be a bridge between two distinct communities. Somebody who is both a lawyer and a political scientist and can speak to these two communities. It might be a mediator between two conflicting factions. So we immediately have associations as to the role that a particular network node plays in a larger network. Similarly, we can ask ourselves who would be the most important node, the most powerful node in that system. Node A is one candidate because everyone has to go through node A in order to traverse the network. There's also node B that has most connections. And these are in fact different ways of measuring importance of nodes. Node A is very important when it comes to betweener centrality. You have to travel through node A in order to traverse the network. While node B is very important when it comes to degree centrality. It has many connections. It has most connections in the network. And so network analysis is quite intuitive for us humans. And it provides us with measures, but also theories that operationalize many of these intuitions. That makes it particularly interesting for comparative analysis of judicial behavior, because it helps us to abstract from the particular subject matter of the tribunal at issue, of the disputes at issue. We see the connections, we see the structures that are underlying them, irrespective of whether we're talking about a German court or a Canadian court or an international court, for instance. And that then allows us to compare these distinct institutions across jurisdictions. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are ignorant of some of the underlying differences. In fact, these underlying differences that are not captured by network analysis, they often come in at the very end when we interpret the different network structures. So for instance, the network of citations within the World Trade Organization's WTO appellate body is very tight. One decision references a lot of other decisions within that network. In contrast, at the International Court of Justice, that network is relatively sparse. Few decisions reference other decisions by the International Court of Justice. It is at that point then that subject matter experts can use their domain knowledge in order to identify, interpret, and make sense of these differences. So again, network analysis allows us to abstract from these differences in the first place in order to see structures that might provide revealing insights about how a court operates, for instance. But then we can use our domain knowledge in order to make sense of these findings and to add actual fabric to them. Now, I've talked a lot about network analysis without really explaining what network analysis is. Well, network analysis really comes with two types of tools. One is a set of theoretical tools, and the other is a set of metrics, a set of measurements, how we can put a number on the importance of a particular node. Let me provide some examples on each of them. So, network analysis theory comes with a set of concepts, and I won't go into all of them, but let me just highlight two. Over the past 30 years or so, scholars have found that networks across different domains, biology, social world, but also the technical world, the internet, they share similar characteristics. They are often scale-free networks. What does that mean? Well, they are networks that are subject to a particular underlying dynamic. So in a normally distributed network, you would have many nodes that have a couple of different connections. And then there are very few nodes that have no connections. And there are very few nodes that have a lot of connections. But that's not how most networks look. Most networks are scale-free networks that we encounter in the real world, including in law, and they are subject to a power law dynamic. Power law dynamic means that most nodes have very few connections, and there are some nodes that have a lot of them, that have a lot of them. There are the super rich nodes, in essence, that have an immense number of connections. And that, when we think about it, rings true intuitively when we think about things such as a citation network. We have these landmark cases that are cited and cited and cited again. And then we have many cases that are buried in obscurity, that are never cited or that may be cited once. The takeaway is that these scale-free networks, they are actually very skewed. They're very extreme. While in a normally distributed network, mediocrity rules, the average is what's most frequent. In a scale-free network, we actually have a dominance of those nodes that are very highly connected. On the one hand, that makes these networks very resilient because it means that the network structure is clustered around these very important nodes, but at the same time that also creates vulnerabilities. It means that if you take one of those central nodes out, then the entire network might collapse. And you can think about this again in terms of citation networks. If you have a decision that has been overruled that's very marginal, nobody really takes notice. But if you have a central decision in a network that is suddenly overruled, that's taken out of the network, that can have repercussions for the entire network. And so there are some theoretical insights that come from disciplines outside of the law that can help us explore the law further. One of the reasons why we see this power law distribution is because of a second tendency in these scale-free networks, and that is known as preferential attachment. Those nodes that already have a lot of connections, they attract more connections over time. So the famous become very famous. The stars become superstars. So you might not be interested in the music of a particular artist, Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, but you know them because other people know them, and that makes them even more well known. And so this reinforcing dynamic where the richer get richer, the famous become more famous, the landmark cases become even more important as time goes on. That's the process of preferential attachment, which again explains part of the network structure. There are also network measures that are really useful and that come with network analysis. And they can be used in order to operationalize some of these insights. There are three network measures in particular, or three types of network measures. There are node metrics. They describe the placement of a node in a network. Is it the node that has most connections? Is it the node that is centrally located so that all other nodes are connected with that node? Is that node surrounded by a neighborhood of other very highly connected nodes. And so we can take these network structures into account when we put a number on the importance of nodes. And that's, for instance, very important when we think about measuring the importance of precedent. Network metrics provide us with the tools to quantify the importance of precedents in these citation networks, for example. Then there are also group measures. So within a network, we often have clusters of nodes that are connected. And network group measures allow us to identify these groupings. And so there might be groupings that relate to a particular area of law, again, when we talk about a citation network. Or if we talk about a social network, there might be groupings that relate to a number of clerks that have clerked for the same judge or that have gone to the same institution. And so these groupings allow us to understand underlying segmentation within that network, the underlying dynamics of that network. And finally, network measures. I've already hinted at those. So how many connections are there in the network as compared to the number of possible connections? Some networks are very dense, other networks are very sparse. What explains this difference? Now let's proceed to network analysis of law, and I provide a lot of context here in the actual paper citing studies. Here I'll just limit myself to explaining the distinction between the two main areas of network analysis applications in the law: social network analysis on the one hand and document network analysis on the other hand. So why are they important? Well, they are important because if we look at actors in social networks, including in legal networks, we can actually tap into this rich body of literature known as social network analysis. So there are theories that come with it that have been applied to other social networks that might also apply to the law. And so if, as scholars have done in the past, look for instance at how clerks go from one judge to the other, or how institutions such as law schools shape the judiciary in a country, these social dynamics, or arbitrators, and are pointed to the same cases, these social dynamics, they can be investigated with the toolkit of social network analysis, using concepts such as social capital, homophily, where actors that are similar are drawn to each other. So there's a whole range of tools, both theoretical, but also in terms of implementation, that can help us understand actor networks in the law. What is particular about these actor networks is they are usually bidirectional. So if you are my friend, I'll be your friend as well. So these connections often go into both directions. With document networks, and especially citation networks, where the links between documents are cross-references of one judicial decision to the other, it's a little bit different, because these are directional networks that only go necessarily in one direction, because an earlier decision can be cited by a later decision, but of course the earlier decision cannot cite the later decision. And that then has repercussions on how we understand the formation of these networks. While, for instance, social networks are subject to a type of recursiveness where the network structure impacts the individuals and the individuals impact the network. So it's sort of a feedback loop where actors that are similar to each other, they are drawn to each other and they become more similar in the process, which creates then these clusters in the network that make them more similar. These types of dynamics we don't have in network analysis of citations, because there it's really just static. The earlier decision is being cited by the later decision, and so we lack this recursiveness. That means that different tools have to be used for these types of different networks. If we try to model them, we have to model them in different ways. And so it's important to keep this distinction in mind. There's a rich body of scholarship on both of these, and I reference that in the paper. Let me conclude with the challenges and then the research frontier. There are three challenges in particular that I see. One relates to data. I point to a couple in the paper, but let me just highlight here the aspect of missing data. Missing data is a particularly important problem when it comes to network analysis, because if you take one node out of a network, it often skews the entire network dynamics. So think about the network of you and your friends. the group of friends around you is being held together by you as the central pillar. But if you take yourself out of that network structure would completely disappear. And so it's very important that we strive for having all the data if possible and are very sensitive to the dangers of missing data. A second challenge relates to how we match legal research questions with the appropriate methods. So for instance, if we're interested in measuring the importance of precedent, how do we actually go about this? Should we just count the number of times that a decision is being cited? Do we need to take the network structure into account? And if so, there are different metrics. There's a page rank. There is authority scores. And these different measurements, they highlight certain aspects and they neglect others. And so knowing about what the method does and what you're actually trying to do is really important in order to connect them. And finally, validation is often a critical issue. So how do you know that the network measure that you produced actually makes sense? And there are different techniques for doing that. But it's really not straightforward, because sometimes network analysis is being used to debunk existing widely held perceptions. So there have been very important network studies that try to show that actually other cases than those that are being used in textbooks are dominating a citation network. And then you cannot use the textbook as your point of reference, because that's actually what you're trying to go against or correct. And so validation is something we have to keep in mind, and that's often quite challenging to do. Let me close with reflection on the research frontier. I see two aspects in particular that are going to be very important. One is to combine network analysis with natural language processing. So one pervasive critique of network analysis, especially of citation network analysis, is that, right, it's very interesting that this court's decision cites that other decision, but what does that really mean? I mean, is that decision criticizing the other one? Is it following the other? Is it even overruling the other? So just having this tie doesn't actually tell us a lot about what's going on in that citation network. And so by supplementing network analysis with natural language processing, we can identify sometimes whether this decision is actually distinguishing itself from that decision, or whether it's citing that decision as an endorsement in order to follow it. And so we can provide more rich context and potentially also the type of subject matter at issue by combining it with these natural language processing tools. In the paper, again, I provide some specific examples. And finally, inferential network analysis. So much of what I've been talking about today and what I talk about in the paper relates to descriptive network analysis. So trying to identify network structures. But really, next frontier is to try to explain these network structures. Why does a network take a particular form? And for that, we need inferential network analysis, where we model other types of networks and then compare to the existing network in order to identify what drives these types of differences. I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to your comments and feedback. You can find my email here on the slide. Thank you very much.